Right, let's get started. Basically, this is our webinar on transfer pricing. My name is Patrizia de Windlegg-Wood. I am the managing partner of IM&C Limited in the UK. IM&C Limited is the UK branch of an existing German company, IM&C GmbH. Which was founded a number of years ago, back in 1991, by Mr. Fred's firm. You will understand why we take particular interest on this topic of transfer pricing as we go through the presentation. Largely, we have this SAP add-on that we introduced in the market a few years ago that actually is fit for purpose for this topic. Just to start with the presentation, I will try to be pragmatic. I mean, I'm not here to tell people what transfer price is and what is the best practice on transfer pricing. I'm not a tax lawyer, therefore I will not go through into topics that wouldn't add any value. I will only try to tell you what we can do about it and try to be pragmatic. Okay, let's go through our introduction. So, as I said already, most of you already know enough about transfer pricing methods, so it is not my place to tell you what it is like and what is best to do. So the idea is that during this session, I will show you how our product, our Group Cost and Profitability engine, can help to achieve what you want with transfer price. Our Group Cost and Profitability engine, as was mentioned on our newsletter last month, essentially is an SAP add-on and essentially is capable of aggregating and calculating data that are coming directly from ERP systems, so data that are extracted from ERP systems. GCP is in this particular scenario can cope with any transfer pricing calculation methodology, so we are not favoring cost plus over anything else. Later in the slides there will be a mention of an example which is based on the cost plus methodology, but this is only just because we were looking for an example, but in reality we can cope with any type of calculation. Okay, so let's get started with transfer pricing. So we all heard about arm's length principle and essentially what it is, and also the fact that arm's length principle is what is accepted by everybody. Now, very recently, we are talking about 19th of July, so 10 days ago, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development came up with a very, very strong statement about transfer pricing and what they want to do about transfer pricing. And they declared that they will undertake some work to look at cases where essentially people take advantage on the transfer pricing to be able to avoid tax, which is essentially what very many companies end up doing. And essentially the OECD announced this in a very, very strong way and basically decided that they want to target this. They came up with some suggestions that I'm not mentioning in this slide. I will attach an article to our next newsletter for all of you to be able to read. But essentially, they made some suggestions that still has to be accepted or still have to be viewed actually by some of the countries. So it's something very new. But essentially, we look at transfer pricing rules becoming stricter everywhere. And therefore, in this kind of context, what we thought in IM&C is that our product that works so well for companies that have problems with unrealized profit on inventory, so intercompany profits, could actually be used in the concept of transfer pricing to the same advantage, because basically it really helps with providing an end-to-end view of the process so that the transfer pricing strategy can be controlled a little bit more, and companies can try to maximize their profits without necessarily ending up not being compliant with what the local tax jurisdictions are expecting. Essentially here, on the slide here, I have an example. I mean, there are several cases in which companies essentially declare that their transfer pricing when a country sells to another country is the equivalent of the cost plus 5%. When the tax authorities walk into the office, they actually think that the transfer price that was applied was actually cost plus 15%. This because of the numbers published. Now, very often I came across in my former career as a financial consultant that essentially very often these discrepancies are due to the fact that companies really struggle to provide reliable documentation and precise documentation related to what was done. So it is very, very difficult to provide evidences of the fact that effectively nothing was wrong, or provide evidences of how the transfer pricing process was actually set up and was actually working. Very often the reason is that it is very difficult for companies to extract a complete view of the value chain from end to end, for example, by product, so that the transfer price applied could be validated. It is very difficult sometimes to have an overview. Now, what happens with GCP is that GCP extracts data from ERP and non-ERP systems, recreate within its own functionality the supply chain or the value chain, whatever you want to call it, as it is. So recreates an end-to-end view of what happened in the transactional systems from the start of the life of this product to the end of the life of the product. And essentially is also able to split the various components of the cost and split obviously the component which is profit, margin, etc., etc. So essentially what can happen is that regardless of how many systems spread over how many geographies, etc., it doesn't really matter. All the data can come into GCP, be reorganized and reaggregated to create a view which is an end-to-end view. And therefore, this way, it is relatively easy if there are requests for evidences from the tax authorities, for example. It's relatively easy to be able to show how costs and profits developed at local level in the various plants, sites, and also at group level. So how the local contribution to the profit, for example, has also been a part of the final calculation of the intercompany profit at group level. This is another reason why I said that there is a clear connection between the UPI, the unrealized profit on inventory calculation, and the transfer pricing logic, because fundamentally the data that are used to calculate both of them are almost the same, so it's just a different view. Okay, so essentially there are two sides of the coin here, which quite obviously probably people realize. So on one side, we want to be able to say to the tax authorities, we are fully compliant and these are all, we can show you exactly what we did. On the other hand, and if we go ahead, we are also talking about Amazon, Starbucks, etc. All these groups essentially were 100% compliant. They were clever. They worked around it, but they were 100% compliant. So now, we don't want, as IM&C or probably as anyone else either, want to make a judgment on whether this was good or bad, but fundamentally the idea is that if you have tools that allow you to play with the transfer pricing scenario, that allow you to look into it and say, okay, my cost in this particular region, in this particular plant is going up by 3%, my markup has to go up as well. What does this do to my transfer pricing overall? So if I have 15 steps in my value chain before the product is sold externally, so what does happen there? So is the ability of simulating scenario that can actually help companies to make a judgment on where should the things happen, how should the things happen, whether some of the changes that may happen in a particular country, for example, currency fluctuation issues, etc., could have an effect on anything to do with transfer pricing. So it's the ability of going in and simulating and having a look, which is exactly what transfer pricing teams do in their complex Excel spreadsheets. So fundamentally, it's the same thing. The main difference here is that you are taking data from the ERP system, you are putting data on one system, which is GCP. It is essentially can be compared to an SAP module, basically. So you put everything on GCP, and then once everything is on GCP, you rebuild your value chain and you start calculating your transfer price, you start simulating your scenario, and you can take decisions as per what your transfer price strategy could be, essentially, without losing sight of compliance. So you can set parameters, so you can decide that all your parameters that keep you compliant are in the system, are in GCP. So when you simulate, if you try to do something that doesn't make sense, GCP wouldn't do it. So it will tell you, no, you can't do this, you are out of range, for example, in that particular country. So is this ability to sort of play with it in a controlled way, because all the data that are there are data that come from the ERP system. So you are working on real numbers, and you are seeing the effect of your actions onto these real numbers. At the start of this slide, I was referring again to this big meeting that happened on the 19th of July. Basically, what seems to be happening is there may be the need, or there may be a suggestion to shift activities from low tax jurisdictions to where there is a greater economic substance. So the attempt that this committee is making is trying to change the way in which in the last number of years things happened, whereby lots of activities, whether we talk about manufacturing or services here, it doesn't make any difference. I mean, it was the same thing. Loads and loads of activities moved out of countries that were considered too expensive to cheaper countries, but also to low tax jurisdictions, so where people could actually make more profit out of paying a bit less in terms of taxes. So whether this attempt will work or not, it has to be seen, because I think this committee seems to have set themselves a fairly ambitious goal, and we will have to see if it works. But effectively, one of the things that I can definitely say is that if you have the right tools, you can immediately go into your tool, see what it would mean to your value chain to move the production or part of the production of a product from A to B, and see what the effect is in everything, in the whole chain. So I think this is what makes our product fairly powerful in the way it works. Now, the way it works, I couldn't clearly give you a demo of a product on a conversation like this clearly, because it's very difficult to go live into a product which is technically fairly complex. But what I will try to explain to you by showing you a few pictures is fundamentally what do we have in GCP. As I said in one of the previous slides, GCP is able to split the costs, margins, profits, into components, into as many components as it makes sense to split it, so that you can have for each of these components a number of values, which can be historical values, which are generally the values that come from, for example, SAP in this example, but it could be a different ERP system. Then you have a group value, which is generally calculated by GCP. You can also have, although here you don't see it, but you can also have a local value. For example, for the majority of our UPI, intercompany profit projects, we are asked to show the local numbers separate from the group numbers, so that the controller can always see the local number in the local currency, and then he can see the same, basically what the contribution of this particular country is to the global UPI in group currency. So there is always this ability to view the same result from different aspects, from a historical view, group view, local view, which is useful when it comes to things like UPI or transfer price. Now, in this example, again, we tried to keep these examples simple, because as soon as you get into calculations, it's very easy to get lost on slides. But if you look at what happens here, so you see what is the portion of transfer price which is added as a result of a transaction when goods move from company 1 to company 2. You also see, if you look at it, that GCP clearly tells you that your profit is 20 in company 2. The group profit at that stage is 25, because it's made by the 20 that you have in company 2 plus the 5 of company 1. Your transfer pricing is 38 here, of course, because it's the transfer price applied to this particular transaction. If you look at the way the group results are shown, the group results are always shown as a combination of local and group. So you are always taking with you what happened. It's a sort of waterfall. You're always taking with you what happened in the previous transaction. So and I will show you later a screenshot where screenshots always look very busy, but you will see what happens effectively in the system. So essentially, you will see on your screen all these numbers and the different view of these numbers. So you will be able to drill down and look at what happened transaction by transaction, step by step. Now, the same approach, as you can see, is applied to variable cost. So again, the variable cost at group level in company 2 is made by the variable cost that was at historical level in SAP plus the variable cost that was coming from the previous transaction. So I think this is relatively intuitive, I suppose, for people who are familiar with this kind of transactions. Then what happens? Of course, we have another intercompany sale from company 2 to company 3, and here again we actually see what the contribution, we see that actually the transfer price becomes historically the biggest element, and we then carry on with this type of calculation. So obviously here we can have as many steps as possible, but you can actually see what happens here in the calculation of the transfer price, and you can actually visualize what are the elements that can be useful for the transfer pricing teams to work on if they want to take a look at their value chain and how the transfer pricing practically is developing within the value chain. As I said before, essentially you have the capability in GCP to set parameters. So if you don't want the transfer pricing to go beyond a certain level or beyond a certain value, you can actually do it, and you can make sure that this is kept where it should be. This is clearly not a report, this is an example, but another thing that you can do in GCP is actually produce native reports, or for example work with products like Crystal Report to produce graphs, a little bit more sophisticated graphs. So you could effectively take the data after your calculation of transfer price and produce graphs that show you, you know, how the transfer price moves across the value chain. So here we have a couple of things that come up in the slide. So historical data are the data extracted from the ERP system, so they come from newer systems. Group values are calculated in GCP. This is quite clear from this slide. GCP calculates the group values. So it works a little bit like a consolidation tool. It kind of calculates your values at group level. Okay, so now we go. And basically, and then you can see how the group values are always an aggregation of the transactional values. That's pretty obvious, but I think what is good at GCP is that you have this very, very clearly in front of you in the GCP screen. Now, we have a little simulation in a cost plan scenario that I will try to show you on a screen. I mean, as you can see, this is a GCP screen. It's a display financial items screen in GCP. It is practically like SAP. It's exactly the same as SAP, works the same way. It is an SAP add-on, and the look and feel is exactly the same. The sort of numbers that you see on the left of the screen, the sort of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, these are all the levels. As I said, you always have drill down capabilities, so you can drill down and see what happens below and below and below. At this stage, just to be clear with you, at this stage we are working at material levels. This is not product, this is material. So we can actually see what the transfer pricing element of the material is. So we can go to a fairly low level of detail when it comes to transfer pricing and analyze what happens at a really sort of a material level rather than just product level. So basically here we have an example where we have a certain cost here. So this is an example based on the cost plus method that looks at the potential change in cost. So obviously we have a rule behind where the transfer price is calculated and has cost plus a certain percentage, and what we start with is a certain cost. So we have an initial price here which is driven by cost plus a transfer price plus a markup. Now, in the simulation we have a screen here which is basically very simple. It takes a material that we choose from our list that we were looking at before. What we can do is as I said, this is a very, very basic example. It can be as complicated as you wanted, but this is a very simple example. We had our original value of 945. We basically want the value to be different from that. We make a correction of this value here. So we change, for example, the cost at source, let's say, for this particular step. And we have a result where my price changes and becomes 10.39. So what happens next is that essentially when we go back to our screen after having done the simulation, we get the value that we were seeing in the simulation. Again, as I said, this is a very, very basic example of what the simulation can do. But where I wanted to get to is fundamentally these data that you see here, all these numbers come from SAP. So you extract them from your SAP system, you work on them, you reproduce all your supply chain, and you have all your starting point, as we had in the previous screen here. This is your starting point. You have a beginning balance at the top, and then you have all your materials and what happens to the materials step by step. Then you decide to go and simulate and change something to see what actually is the effect of your change, and then you go back and you have another screen where basically you see what happened to your cost, to your price, whatever it is. It is a fairly simple example. I mean, what we did for example, in unrealized profit on inventory and UPI projects for intercompany profit, essentially is always try to show the local value of the intercompany profit and how the local value gets carried forward step by step, transaction by transaction, and then it goes and contributes to a certain level to the final margin, basically to the final intercompany profit at group level and in group currency. Is this ability to sort of constantly go down and down and down the hierarchy and show what happens at each stage and be able to simulate and manipulate and see what could be the best available scenario. Now, if people don't like screens like this, they tend to be not the most user-friendly thing to look at. There is, as I said, the opportunity to then produce reports and produce graphs that can actually show you the same results, but in a slightly friendlier and a slightly easier to look manner. But fundamentally, this is what we can do to actually make some of the transfer pricing processes within companies a little bit easier and, in my opinion, also more accurate. I came across in my career a number of companies where these transfer pricing spreadsheets were so complex and so huge that, you know, I would have been very surprised if the accuracy had been really, really great. I mean, I'm fairly sure they were reasonably accurate, but I wouldn't be surprised if something, you know, went missing somewhere along the way in such tools. Now, in terms of summarizing what I said, basically, the Group Cost and Profitability engine, as you see, looks like SAP, and it is an SAP add-on, has been designed as an SAP add-on, but can also work with other ERP systems. So, for example, we had clients where part of the sites were on a completely different type of ERP, like J.D. Edwards, for example. In that case, obviously, we use ETL tools so that we extract the data from SAP. For the SAP sites, we then can extract the data from the other ERP systems with ETL tools, and then we put everything together in GCP. So this tool clearly works better for SAP customers because also the look and feel is identical, so people are quite familiar with the way these things work. It can work for any ERP system. If the supply chain includes third parties, for example, when I talk about broken links, it does happen that if you are in a situation in the transfer pricing value chain, in your value chain, in which you use a third party, a subcontractor, and clearly this third party somehow figures in your value chain, you can have broken links because they are clearly not necessarily on your system. So this way, GCP can also reproduce these types of scenarios. So if in the transfer pricing basic process, end-to-end process, you have something particularly complicated because a product goes out to be worked on to a third party, then comes back, there is an element of profit somewhere there that can get lost. This clearly doesn't happen when you're working with a tool like this, because you can create a virtual item, a virtual plant or whatever it is, which basically behaves like nothing was actually outside of your value chain. So that is the other sort of really valuable attribute of this product, that essentially you do not have cases in which your chain is not complete, in which your chain cannot be analyzed in full. Basically, what I said also about the data extracted can be elaborated and recalculated before being reported. So what I was saying before is essentially, if you have any of the data that you can extract, you put them onto our system aggregates them appropriately based on what you want to do with them, and then you can actually run the calculations. Going back to what I said at the start, that our tool can cope with any transfer pricing methodology, the reason is that essentially it's simply different aggregations of data and different formulas. So as long as the tool can manage that, it can cope with any methodology. I mentioned in the report, it's basically here again because it is interesting always to have the ability to have different views and see graphs that look perhaps a little bit nicer than the typical sort of native report. So you can always have these. What I was mentioning about the transparency and accuracy, one of the things that I really find very good about our product is there is a lot of information in there, but that lot of information that can be a little bit scary when you look at the screen because it looks a little bit complex. But the fact that it's all there helps enormously with transparency and with accuracy, because you can see everything. So you don't have a final number without being able to go back and see how this number actually came about. So obviously there is a calculation, but you can always drill down. You can take a top-down approach, you can take a bottom-up approach, you can do whatever you like with these numbers that come from your ERP system. So in my opinion, there is really an opportunity to simulate and to do things, but without losing sight of what you want to achieve and how much transparency you want this data to have. This recording, you will find also my details here. So please feel free to send me an email, give me a call. If there is, if you have any query on any of the things that I said and I presented, I will be more than happy to answer your question and help you. But otherwise, thank you very much for joining me and for looking at my slides.
Thank you very much for the presentation.